You have surely heard the name Genghis Khan. But who was he truly? A barbarian who unleashed chaos and destruction, or a genius who altered the course of world history? This story will follow the arc of his life, from the fragility of childhood to the mystery of his final days. It will reveal how a boy named Temüjin, abandoned and powerless, transformed into a ruler who shook the very foundations of the earth. How did he unite the Mongol tribes, who for centuries had done nothing but wage war against one another? How did he forge an army that, in only a handful of years, conquered China, swept through Central Asia, crushed Persia, and pressed all the way to the Caucasus? What secrets clung to the final years of his life, and why has his resting place never been found? This is not merely a tale of battles and conquests. It is the story of how a single man bent the destiny of half the world. Suggest in the comments topics for new stories and subscribe to the channel. New bedtime stories come out here every day. And so we begin, stepping back to the vast wind-swept steppes of Mongolia. The year was 1162. Amid rolling hills, endless grasslands, and rivers that glistened like ribbons of silver beneath the sun, a child was born. His name was Temüjin, a boy destined to leave a mark deeper than fire upon the chronicles of humanity. His father, Yesugei-Bata, came from the Borjigin clan, a branch of the Kiat tribe. The Borjigin traced their lineage back to the legendary Bodin Char, himself a descendant of the mythical blue wolf and the grey doe, the primal ancestors of all Mongols. Yesugei was known as a man of courage, skilled in battle, respected by many among the nomads. Yet he did not command absolute power. The Mongol world of that time was fragmented, brittle. Tribes rose and fell like gusts of wind. The Temüjins, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, each clan made alliances, only to shatter them just as quickly. War flared endlessly. Wars for pasture, wars for cattle, wars for supremacy. Temujin's mother, Holun, was born into the Olkunut tribe, itself tied to the Merkits. Legend says she was abducted by Yesugei. He had once come upon a caravan in which Holun travelled with her husband. Yesugei attacked, slew the man, and carried the young woman away, making her his principal wife. In the harsh traditions of the steppe, such abductions were not uncommon. They were part of the grim fabric of nomadic life. When their son was born, Yesugei gave him the name Temüjin. It honoured, or perhaps marked, the defeat of a warrior from the Tatar clan whom Yesugei had recently slain in battle. The name was meant to carry strength, victory, and the aura of conquest. Yet destiny had other plans. Soon, trials far heavier than a warrior's burden would fall upon the child and his family. When Temüjin reached the age of 9, his father took him on a long journey across the steppes. Their destination was the camp of the Ongirat tribe. Among them lived a young girl named Berte, chosen to be Temüjin's bride. The Ongirats were among the most powerful and numerous clans of the Mongol steppe. A union with them promised strength and protection, a bond to secure the Borjigin family's fragile position in an unstable world. By custom, the boy was left in the household of his future wife, so that he might grow familiar with her family, breathe the air of her people, and learn to call her camp a second home. It was a gesture of trust, a seed planted for a lifetime bond. But while Temüjin remained among the Ongirats, fate struck a cruel blow. On his way back, Yesugei paused among the Tatars, ancient enemies who had long nursed grudges against his clan. To avoid recognition, he concealed his name, but hatred has a memory sharper than steel. The Tatars remembered his hand in the death of their kin. They laced his food with poison. Yasuge managed to ride home, but agony tore through his body like a fire beneath his skin. Within days he was dead. The leader of the family was gone. In the world of the nomads, survival depended on men who could fight, defend, and command. Without him, the household was exposed, like a lone tent left standing in the storm. Relatives who once followed Yasuge quickly abandoned his widow and children. They took the herds, the lifeblood of steppe existence, and left the family to fend for themselves. Hoylun, Temüjin's mother, revealed a strength no less fierce than that of a warrior. Gathering her children, she led them to a place where they might find shelter from the relentless winds, a hollow where reeds bent and rivers still flowed. Together they built crude huts of branches and grass. Their days became a struggle for food, catching fish in shallow streams, digging for roots, gathering berries from thorny shrubs. They hunted ground squirrels and small birds, sometimes snaring a hare or a timid gazelle. More often, they survived on bitter plants and whatever meagre catch the river gave them. The steppe was merciless. Without allies, they were prey. Bands of raiders struck their camp, most often the Temüjids, once loyal allies of Yasuge, now disdainful enemies. They despised Hoylun and her children, scorning them as outcasts, stripped of honour, stripped of status. Amid this wilderness of betrayal, Temüjin grew. Hunger carved discipline into his body. Danger sharpened his mind. He discovered a truth that would guide his life. Only by gathering people, by binding them together, could one endure the storms of fate. Alone, a man was nothing. Together, even the weak had become unbreakable. From his earliest years, Temüjin showed a spirit of iron. He could not bear injustice nor tolerate arrogance. He defended his family fiercely, willing to take risks others would shrink from. One story from his youth casts a shadow over his memory like a scar across the steppe. It involved his half-brother Bekta, the son of Yasuge's junior wife. After the death of their father, Bekta tried to seize the role of leader, claiming the best food and animals, pressing his authority upon the younger boys. Resentment grew like fire beneath dry grass. And then came the day when the flame could no longer be contained. Temüjin and his brother Yassa set an ambush for Bekta. Arrows flew. Blood fell upon the earth. A family bond had been broken forever. After the death of their father, Bekta, the eldest among the brothers, began to act as though he alone carried the right to rule. He claimed the choicest food, seized the best animals, and treated his younger siblings as subordinates. Resentment smouldered. It grew in silence, like sparks hidden beneath dry grass, until one day the fire broke free. Temüjin and his brother Yassa set an ambush. When the moment came, arrows hissed through the air. Bekta fell, struck down by the hands of his own kin. By the standards of the steppe, the act was tangled in contradiction. To kill a brother was to violate the sacred blood bond. Yet to endure his tyranny might have meant the ruin of the family. Their mother, Hoylun, wept and chastised them for the crime. But she also knew the harsh truth. This act, dark though it was, had saved the unity of her children. Without it, they might have perished. From that moment onward, Temüjin assumed the mantle of eldest son. Decisions that once lay with others now rested in his hands. He chose when to move the camp, where to hunt, which pastures to risk. He stood as shield against raids, guiding his family through the perilous wilderness of the steppes. But in that world, no family could endure alone for long. The Temüjids, former allies turned enemies, saw their weakness. They raided with cruel precision, capturing Temüjin and dragging him away into their camp. To ensure submission, They bound his neck and arms with a heavy wooden yoke, a brutal collar of planks that weighed down his body and chained his spirit. Escape seemed impossible. For months he lived as a captive, forced into menial labour, humiliated at every turn. Yet even in captivity his presence was striking. Among the Temüjins lived a poor herdsman named Sargon Shira. He noticed the boy's quiet strength, the dignity he carried even in chains. And one night, when the guards had collapsed into sleep, Sargon Shira made a choice that would echo across history. He loosened the yoke from Temüjin's neck. He hid him in a mound of wool and hay, covering him with mats, concealing him from searching eyes. At dawn he guided him toward freedom, showing him a path through the steppe. The risk was immense. Discovery meant death. Yet the man chose to act. For Temüjin, this was not just an escape. It was proof that loyalty could be born even among strangers, that faith could rise even from poverty. He never forgot. Years later, as Khan, Temüjin rewarded Sargon Shira with land, wealth, and freedom for his descendants. When he returned from captivity, he was no longer the boy who had once trembled in exile. Something within him had hardened. Chains had carved discipline into his body. Humiliation had tempered his will. He had learned the essence of survival. In this world, it was not wealth or noble blood that secured life. It was the power to gather people, to hold them together with justice and strength, and to strike without mercy at those who threatened them. Thus ended the harshest season of his youth, the childhood of an outcast. From its ashes rose a new determination. Ahead lay his first alliances, his first blood spilled in battle, his first attempts to carve a space of power in the endless steppes. Temüjin's first step was toward the Onghirat clan, where his promised bride Berta still awaited. This union was more than the fulfillment of a vow once spoken by his late father Yasuge. It was a crucial foundation for legitimacy, a bond that could lift him higher within the shifting hierarchy of the steppes. The Onghirats welcomed him with respect. Soon after, the wedding was celebrated with ceremony, songs, and the blessings of both families. Berta was not only a bride, she would become his companion in every trial, a woman of rare intelligence and immense courage, destined to stand beside him through storms of war and burdens of power. Their bond was more than political. It was a love that endured, but fate did not allow long days of peace. Almost immediately after the marriage, disaster struck. The Merkits, those very people from whom Yasuge had once stolen Huelun, Temujin's mother, returned to exact their vengeance. Under cover of sudden attack, they descended upon Temujin's encampment. The camp was scattered, the herds driven off. Berta was seized and carried into captivity. This was Temujin's first true test as a leader. Alone, he had no hope of defeating so strong and numerous an enemy. He needed allies. He turned first to Togrul, Khan of the Kerate, bound to his father by bonds of sworn brotherhood. In earlier years, Yasuge had aided Togrul in regaining his throne, and the memory of that debt lived on. When Temüjin came to him now, Togrul accepted not only out of loyalty to a fallen friend, but also because war with the Merkits promised advantages for his own power. Temüjin also sought the aid of Jamukha, his childhood companion. Together they had hunted on horseback, raced through the grasslands, and shared the oaths of youthful brotherhood. When Temüjin called, Jamukha answered. Their combined strength was formidable. The warriors of the Kerate joined with Jamukha's retinue, and to them flocked men of the steppe who had little wealth but much hunger for change. Poor families, dispossessed fighters, men with nothing left to lose. With these forces united, the warband advanced. The clash with the Merkits came swift and decisive. Camps were stormed, enemy lines broken, yurts set aflame. The Merkits scattered in defeat, their power crushed. Among the rescued captives was Berta herself, restored at last to Temüjin's side. Not long after, she gave birth to their first son, Yoki. Yet the shadows of doubt spread quickly. Berta had been held for months among the Merkits, and whispers arose questioning the boy's parentage. Was he truly Temüjin's son, or the child of captivity? The steppe was merciless with its rumours. Temüjin made his choice. He silenced all speculation by publicly claiming Jochi as his own. It was not only an act of love, but also of strategy. Division could destroy everything he had begun to build. By embracing the child, he embraced unity. This victory marked a turning point. The people saw in Temüjin not merely an orphaned exile, not just the son of a dead chieftain, but a leader capable of forging alliances, of commanding men, of shielding those who entrusted him with their lives. From this moment, his name carried a new weight across the steppes. But power in the steppe was fragile, and alliances could turn as swiftly as the wind. Supporters began to gather around Temüjin. They came not from the ranks of noble clans, but from the poor, the landless, the betrayed. These were men and families who had been excluded from power by the old order. To them, Temüjin's camp was not just a refuge. It was a chance for dignity, for recognition, for a place in a world that had long denied them. Yet even as his influence grew, the first cracks appeared in his bond with Yamuka. Outwardly they still called one another sworn brothers, still clasped hands as companions of youth, but their visions of the future were drifting apart. Yamuka clung to tradition. He believed power should remain in the hands of the aristocracy, determined by lineage, not by talent. Birth, in his eyes, was everything. Temüjin, however, began to shape a new system. He judged men not by their ancestry, but by their merit, by courage, loyalty, and ability. Commanders were chosen for what they could do, not for the names of their ancestors. This principle turned his camp into a beacon for the ambitious and the dispossessed, those who had never been allowed to rise under the old ways. It was then that Temüjin convened his first Kurultai, a great council of his followers. It was not yet a gathering of all Mongol tribes, but of those willing to recognize him as their Khan. Beneath the wide sky of the steppe, amid the smoke of fires and the stamping of horses, he was proclaimed leader of all who accepted his rule. From this council he set about building his army. He structured it not by clan ties but by numbers. Groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Decades and centuries of tradition were overturned in that moment. Meritocracy replaced nobility. A new order was born. At the same time, Temüjin forged alliances. His ties with the Kharet grew stronger. With certain Tatar groups he negotiated peace. With the Uyghurs he secured agreements that would later prove priceless, for they had writing, a script, and a bureaucratic system far ahead of the nomads. These gifts would one day become instruments of empire, but not all were willing to accept the rise of this new power. The Taychuds, proud and noble, despised Temüjin. They saw him as an upstart, a man unworthy of leadership. Time and again he struck against them, launching raids. They were not always full battles. More often, swift attacks, designed to seize cattle, rescue captives, and weaken the enemy's strength. Each raid carved his name deeper into the memory of the steppes. Each victory drew new families into his camp, those weary of injustice and the suffocating grip of the old aristocracy. Meanwhile, his relationship with Yamuka grew more strained. At times they agreed to act together, their forces united. At other times they drifted apart, suspicion thickening like storm clouds on the horizon. Behind the smiles and brotherly embraces, rivalry was taking root. The steppe had room for only one supreme leader, and both men knew it. Jamukha watched with unease as Temüjin's popularity swelled. It was not the nobles who flocked to his banners, but those whom the old clan system had always treated as shadows: the poor, the younger sons, the orphans, the enslaved, and the exiles. To Jamukha this was unsettling, even dangerous. To Temüjin it was the foundation of a new world. At the same time, Temüjin's bond with Togrul grew stronger. Together they launched a campaign against the Tatars, enemies who had long haunted the memory of the Borjigin. At the banks of the Onon River, their combined forces struck a decisive blow. The Tatars were crushed, their power broken. This was no ordinary victory. It was a signal that echoed across the plains. There now existed a power capable not only of defending itself, but of dictating the future. After this triumph, Togrul formally granted Temüjin the title of Khan, recognizing him as his equal among the rulers of the steppe. The gesture raised Temüjin's stature, but it also ignited resentment among many of the old aristocracy. How could they accept that a man who had grown up without wealth, without clan support, without noble titles, now stood beside the greatest leaders of the Mongols? For a time, the fragile bond between Temüjin and Jamukha held. Memories of their brotherhood still lingered, restraining open conflict. But their visions of justice, their ideas of power, diverged too sharply to coexist. What kept them from clashing was only the press of external enemies. Inside, tension thickened, day after day, until it was no longer possible to ignore. Thus ended the first stage of Temüjin's rise. He had proved he could do more than survive. He had shown he could gather men, forge alliances, defeat enemies, and challenge the ancient order that had ruled the steppes for centuries. Ahead lay the greater struggle, the unification of all the Mongol tribes, a struggle in which compromise would have no place. By the early 1180s, it was clear to all that peace between the two most powerful leaders of the steppe, Temüjin and Jamukha, was no more than a memory of childhood bonds. Day by day that bond unravelled, replaced by rivalry for men, for lands, for power, and for the right to decide the destiny of the Mongols. This conflict was larger than two men. Behind Jamukha stood the weight of tradition, the ancient aristocracy, the noble clans who measured worth only by lineage and ancestry. Behind Temüjin stood the others, the forgotten ones, the nameless, the younger sons without inheritance, the shepherds, the warriors, the former slaves, the men for whom birth had offered nothing. For them, Temüjin's new order, built not on blood but on merit, was a doorway to dignity. For the first time, they had a chance to be more than shadows. Two worlds now stood face to face on the great steppe, and the silence between them was breaking. The final rupture came with the Kurultai. At this great council of the tribes, Jamukha was proclaimed Gurkhan, supreme ruler of all Mongols, chosen in the manner of old tradition. This was more than a ceremonial title. It was a clear message from the aristocracy of the steppe. They would not yield to Temüjin's rising influence, nor accept his new model of society where bloodlines no longer defined destiny. Temüjin was absent from that gathering, but his answer was swift. He summoned his own followers, forged his own council, and declared himself Khan. Not of all the Mongols, not yet, but of those willing to march with him, to embrace his rules, his merit-based order, his vision of unity built not on ancestry, but on loyalty and strength. For an entire year, both sides prepared. Camps swelled with tension. Envoys rode from tribe to tribe, pressing each family and lineage to choose a side. Most noble clans pledged themselves to Jamuka, clinging to the prestige of ancient names. To Temüjin came the restless and the hungry, men weary of servitude, men who wanted to be more than pawns in the games of aristocrats. His camp became a refuge for ambition, a haven for those who longed for a different world. By summer, the steppe itself seemed to hold its breath. Both armies were ready. The chosen battlefield lay on the plain of Dalan Balzut, near the sources of the Onon River, a place known to both sides, wide and open, perfect for the manoeuvres of mounted warriors. The chronicles differ in their numbers, but they tell of Jamuka's host numbering 40,000, while Temüjin could muster barely half, 20,000 men. Yet numbers alone did not tell the whole story. Temüjin's army was organised with precision, built upon the decimal system he had long envisioned. 10 men formed a unit, 10 such units 100, then 1,000. Then, when possible, 10,000 under the command of a Tumen. At that time, his forces were not yet strong enough to field true Tumens, but the structure itself brought order and discipline. The men were deliberately mixed from different clans, severing the chains of old loyalties. Each soldier knew. His commander was appointed not because of kinship, but because he had proven his courage, his skill, his loyalty. Jamuka's army remained bound to tradition. Each clan brought its own contingent, each loyal only to its own chief. Though Jamuka carried the title of Gurkhan, his authority in practice was fragile. In the heat of battle, every unit fought in its own way, with its own pride. At dawn the silence shattered. Temüjin struck first. His light cavalry raced forward, swift as shadows, loosing arrows from afar. They circled the enemy flanks, feinting, probing, harassing, sowing confusion. Dust rose in great clouds as horses thundered across the plain. Behind them advanced the heart of his force, heavy cavalry in dense wedges, armed with spears and sabres, prepared to drive straight into the enemy's weakened lines. The steppe had seen countless battles, but this day, at Dalan Balzut, it would witness more than war. It would witness the collision of two visions of the world. For the first few hours, victory seemed within Temüjin's grasp. His men fought as one, moving with discipline, each order executed with precision. Jamuka's forces faltered. Several of his detachments were shattered or scattered. For a moment it appeared that the smaller army might triumph through sheer organisation and unity. But numbers carry their own weight. Jamuka unleashed his reserves. They swept around the flanks of Temüjin's army, striking hard at the sides, splintering the formation. The tide began to shift. Lines that had held firm now bent under pressure. Confusion spread through the rear ranks. When some units broke and fled, panic rippled outward like cracks in ice. By midday, Jamuka's advantage was overwhelming. The order within Temüjin's army dissolved. Retreat began. Some sought refuge in the nearby forests, scattering into the shadows of the trees. Others stood their ground, fighting until the last breath, their blood soaking the earth of Dalan Balzut. Many of Temüjin's companions were slain. Some were captured. Temüjin himself fled with a small band of loyal men, seeking refuge in the mountains. For several days they evaded pursuit, but the noose tightened. At last they were seized and dragged before Jamuka. What followed became a grim monument to the cruelty of the steppe. Jamuka ordered 70 of Temüjin's most trusted supporters executed. The chronicles say they were boiled alive. Perhaps the words were literal, perhaps a description of slow and agonizing torture, staged as a spectacle to terrify all who might dare defy the old order. Temüjin, however, was spared. Why? No source can say for certain. Perhaps it was the faint echo of their boyhood bond. Perhaps Jamuka wished to display a false generosity. Or perhaps he believed humiliation and the loss of his companions would break Temüjin forever. But it did not. Temüjin endured weeks in captivity. Then, under pressure from certain nobles who disapproved of Jamuka's excess, he was released. And instead of vanishing into obscurity, he re-emerged with greater resolve than ever before. Defeat became his teacher. He had seen how even a reformed army, if bound by clan ties, could falter when fear struck. He understood that unity must go deeper than kinship. It must be forged in loyalty to a leader, in discipline, in unbreakable law. So he remade his army once more. From now on, every unit of 10, every 100, every 1,000 would be woven from different families, different clans. No group could stand apart. No faction could claim its own autonomy. All were bound to one chain of command, and to bind them tighter still he imposed harsh discipline. Desertion, cowardice, unauthorized retreat, theft of plunder, disobedience, each was punished without distinction. The law was the same for the son of a herdsman and the grandson of a noble. No bloodline could shield a man from judgment. It was a new kind of army, an army of order, an army of destiny. Alongside this new military system, Temüjin built something deeper, a structure of loyalty that bound men not to clans, but to him, and through him, to the whole community. Each warrior now swore an oath not to his kin, but to his Khan, to his brothers in arms, and to the shared cause. His authority no longer rested on lineage, but on mutual obligation, on justice, on protection, and on the promise of shared fortune. And so strength began to gather around him once more. Families joined him, not because of ancient bloodlines, but because they saw in him what the old nobles lacked. Clear rules, fair rules, rules that any man could understand. In his camp, no one needed to be the son of a chieftain to rise. Courage was enough. Honesty was enough. Work and loyalty were enough. By the early 1190s, Temüjin's army had grown into a formidable force once again. It expanded with each passing season. Even clans that had once scorned him began to reconsider. They saw that this man did not vanish, did not bend, did not surrender. They realized that his power was not a fleeting spark, but a flame that endured. Thus ended another harsh passage of his life, from the depths of catastrophic defeat to the birth of a new strength, one unseen before in the steppe. And ahead awaited a great Kurultai, a gathering that would alter not only his fate, but the fate of all Mongolia. By the dawn of the 13th century, the steppe no longer resembled the old world of shifting alliances, fragile clan balances, and hereditary privilege. For 2 decades, Temüjin had dismantled the old order piece by piece. Of his enemies, 3 major powers remained: the Karites, the Tatars, and the Naimans. Rich in herds, strong in warriors, rooted in tradition, they resisted the longest. The Tayshuds and the Merkits, once formidable, had been scattered or destroyed. The final fall of the Tayshuds came through a series of lightning raids. Their camps were burned, their herds driven off, their survivors either slain or absorbed into Temüjin's army. Absorbed, but transformed. for within his ranks they shed their tribal identity, becoming soldiers in a new brotherhood. The first great campaign of this new era was against the Khwarezms. For many years their Khan Togrul had been Temüjin's ally and protector, but the balance had shifted. Sensing the rise of Temüjin's power, Togrul sought to destroy him before it was too late. Conflict was inevitable. In 1203 Temüjin gathered his forces, not only his own men, but also defectors from among the Khwarezms themselves, who had grown weary of Togrul's faltering rule. The armies clashed. The Khwarezms were shattered, utterly defeated. Togrul fled into the wilderness, but his own people soon turned against him. He was killed not by foreign hands, but by those who no longer wished to follow a fallen leader. The remnants of the Khwarezms flowed into Temüjin's host, stripped of autonomy, absorbed into the living body of his new nation. Next, he turned toward an older enemy, the Tatars, those who had poisoned his father, Yasuge. Now, after generations of blood feud, their fate stood before him. In the year 1202, the Tatars met their end. In a decisive battle, Temüjin's disciplined army shattered their power once and for all. But victory was only the beginning. He ordered that every grown man, every male taller than the wheel of a cart, be executed. Women and children were taken and distributed among his followers. It was not only vengeance for the poisoning of his father, it was terror made into law, a warning to every tribe that resistance meant annihilation, that defiance would erase not only warriors, but bloodlines. The message carried across the steppe like thunder. There could be no middle ground. To resist was to die. Only one great enemy remained, the Naimans, rich in herds, strong in warriors, commanding wide territories in western Mongolia. They were led by their Khan, Küşlüg. Their army was formidable, and their influence still extended across many allies. In 1204, the reckoning came. Temüjin's forces, drilled in discipline and guided by the order of the decimal system, advanced with precision. The battle was fierce, but the outcome clear. The Naimans were crushed. Their camps fell, their banners burned. Küşlüg himself fled first to the Karahitai, and later farther west, where he would continue his struggle, but not against Temüjin. His war would be fought with other states, far beyond the reach of the Mongol steppe. The Naimans ceased to exist as an independent power. With their fall, resistance in Mongolia crumbled. The last fragments of opposition either fled to distant lands or surrendered without a fight. For the first time, the steppe was united under a single will. In the spring of 1206, a great Kurultai was held on the banks of the Onon River. It was unlike any before. From every corner of Mongolia, representatives gathered, chieftains and commanders, elders and relatives, councillors and common warriors. It was not merely a council. It was the birth of a new state, a new order, a new age. There, Temüjin was proclaimed Great Khan of all the Mongols. From that day, his name entered history as Genghis Khan, Oceanic Khan, Universal Ruler, a title that carried the weight of limitless authority over people and land. At this Kurultai, the foundations of empire were laid. The military order Temüjin had built was formally enshrined. The people were divided into units of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, binding them into one structure. And with this came the birth of law itself, the great Yassa. It was not a single written code, but a living body of rules, carried in memory and spoken by voice. It covered every realm of life. Rules of war, the division of spoils, punishments for crime, succession of power, regulation of trade, even the details of daily conduct. Lying, theft, desertion, rebellion, treachery, all carried the same punishment. death. The Yassa was more than law. It was a mirror of Temüjin's vision. Order in place of chaos, discipline in place of weakness, unity in place of division, and above all it was equal for all. Whether shepherd or noble, slave or prince, the rules bound every man alike. For the first time the steppe had a law higher than blood, and the world trembled on the horizon. One of the most striking decisions of the Great Kurultai was the official proclamation of religious tolerance. In Genghis Khan's realm, every faith was permitted to breathe. Shamans and Buddhists, Muslims and Christians, Nestorians and Taoists, all were free to worship their gods without fear. More than that, priests and monks, imams and shamans were exempt from taxes and from military service. Faith itself was placed beyond the reach of worldly burdens. At the same gathering, power was distributed among his family and trusted companions. His brother Qassar was placed at the head of the personal guard responsible for the Khan's safety. Temüjin, another brother, became custodian of the royal jur, entrusted with the household, provisions and the order of the camps. Kachyun was charged with the defence of the internal lands, guarding the heart of the empire. His senior generals too received more than military titles. They became governors in all but name, rulers of their territories, empowered to collect taxes, recruit men, declare campaigns and maintain order. They owed allegiance to the great Khan, but within their domains they held wide authority. Thus, a new hierarchy took shape. At its pinnacle stood the Khan and his family. Beneath them, a new aristocracy, formed not of noble birth, but of merit and service. Below them were the warriors, the backbone of the state. Next came the herders, artisans and servants, and at the base of this pyramid were the captives and slaves, yet even they could rise, for in this order valour and loyalty could lift a man from bondage to honour. When the Great Kurultai ended, Genghis Khan was no longer merely the leader of united Mongolia. He had become the founder of a new empire, an empire destined to spread beyond the steppe into the lands of China, Central Asia, Persia and Europe. The long road of unification was complete. Now began the road of conquest. By 1206, as supreme ruler of Mongolia, Genghis Khan understood a truth etched into the fabric of his people. To preserve unity, to hold together his vast army, its restless energy had to be directed outward. For the Mongols, life was sustained by war, by plunder, by the expansion of pasture and territory. Peace, if left idle, would fracture the bond. The first natural target was the north of China, the wealthy and populous lands of the Jin dynasty. The Jin, founded by the Yuxians, had long interfered in steppe politics. They played tribes against each other, showered some chieftains with gifts, threatened others with force. It was the Jin who had once supported Temüjin's enemies, the Naimans and the Kerates, in their efforts to stop Mongol unification. There was more. In earlier years, the Mongols themselves had paid tribute to the Jin. To Genghis Khan, this was not simply an insult. It was a symbol of subjugation, a chain he vowed never again to wear. The horizon shifted. The steppe looked south. The empire's gaze fell upon China. Before launching his campaign against the mighty Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan turned first to diplomacy. He directed his attention to Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom lying between Mongolia and the borders of Jin. Formerly, Western Xia was a vassal of the Jin emperors, yet in truth it sought independence, watching the Mongols' rising power with wary eyes. In the spring of 1209, Genghis Khan marched his armies against them. He encircled their capital, battering its walls with relentless assaults. For weeks the fighting raged, until at last Western Xia submitted. They agreed to pay tribute and to provide military support when called, though they retained their sovereignty. For Genghis Khan this was enough. The victory opened the road southward, a direct path to the gates of Jin. 2 years later the storm broke. An army, estimated by chroniclers at 90 to 100,000 men, crossed the Great Wall. The first strikes fell upon the border garrisons and fortified outposts. Many surrendered with little fight, their commanders choosing survival over futile resistance. They knew what the Mongol advance meant. Opposition was destruction. Obedience was life. But Genghis Khan knew this war would be unlike any other he had waged. The battles of the steppe had been wars of speed and open plains, of horse archers and manoeuvre. Now he faced cities with stone walls, defenders shielded by towers and fortresses, supply routes defended by bastions of masonry. To overcome them, cavalry alone was not enough. So he drew upon the knowledge of conquered peoples, Uyghur scribes, Tangut artisans, Chinese engineers. They crafted siege engines, catapults, and rams. They shaped towers that loomed against walls, machines of timber and fire. With these tools the Mongols gained a new weapon, patience. They could now starve cities, crush their gates, tear down walls. The first great campaigns unfolded in the provinces of Hebei and Shaanxi. Mongol detachments moved methodically, destroying fortifications, severing roads, seizing granaries, cutting off supplies. One by one cities fell. Yanqing, a strategic centre of northern China, and Datong guarding a vital mountain pass, became symbols of this new war. The Mongol strategy was merciless in its simplicity. First the city was encircled, its lifelines severed. Then the siege began, engines pounding the walls day and night. If the city surrendered, its people often lived, though they lived under tribute, submission and conscription. If it resisted, its fate was sealed. Massacre, enslavement, fire, and ruin. The campaign reached its climax with the siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, modern Beijing. In 1213 the Mongols surrounded it, pressing their assault. But the walls held, the resistance was stubborn, and Genghis Khan chose pragmatism over waste. He withdrew part of his forces, accepting peace. The Jin emperor agreed to pay tribute, send in wealth into the coffers of the Mongol camp. For now, the storm paused. But storms never pause for long. In 1214 the fragile peace collapsed. The Jin dynasty broke its promises, seeking to reassert power in the northern provinces. Genghis Khan returned, and this time he came with patience sharpened into steel, with discipline honed into a weapon. Zhongdu, the great capital of the Jin, was encircled. Roads were severed, supplies cut off. Its walls towered, strong and unyielding, its granaries well stocked, its garrison determined. But no fortress could hold forever against the will of the steppe. The siege dragged on for months. The Mongols hurled themselves against the stone, not blindly but with method. Siege towers rolled forward. Giant trebuchets launched boulders, fire and thunderous bursts of incendiary mixtures. Primitive gunpowder bombs, already known to Chinese defenders, now flashed in the skies of the capital. Fire and stone fell like rain. At last, in 1215, Zhongdu surrendered. Terms were agreed, the city would be spared. Its people, weary and starved, hoped for mercy. But fate is fragile. In the restless days that followed, disorder broke out. A quarter of the city rose in rebellion. Genghis Khan's response was swift and merciless. The streets ran red. Chronicles tell of 50,000 slain. Others were dragged into slavery or forced into exile. Mercy had been offered. Defiance had destroyed it. With the fall of Zhongdu, the Jin Emperor abandoned the north. He fled south to Kaifeng, carrying the imperial court beyond the reach of the Mongols. It was an act that signalled the end of northern China. Though the dynasty still lived, it was now a shadow, paying tribute, recognising Genghis Khan's supremacy, yielding its richest lands. For 2 more years, Mongol armies spread like wildfire through the provinces, extinguishing pockets of resistance. Liaoyang, Taiyuan, Pingqiang, city after city was taken. Each fortress that defied was tested, and each fell. One story stands apart. At Tongguan, a mountain stronghold, the defenders held out despite weeks of bombardment. Stones shattered their walls, but their resolve held firm. Then Genghis Khan gave a different order. His men dammed the river that supplied the fortress with water. Days passed. Thirst broke what stone could not. The gates opened. Tongguan surrendered. This war was not fought by steel alone. For the first time, Genghis Khan wielded politics as a weapon as sharp as the sword. Cities were offered terms: surrender, keep your leaders, preserve your way of life, but recognize his supremacy. Many accepted. They saw the choice clearly: submission and survival, resistance and erasure. By 1217, the north of China lay firmly in Mongol hands. The banners of Genghis Khan rose over cities once thought impregnable, but he did not press further into the southern lands. He knew that to hold what he had already conquered would demand immense resources: men, supplies, patience. And beyond the mountains, to the west, another storm was gathering. The Karakitan Khanate was rising. Alongside it, tensions flared with the Muslim trading states of Central Asia. The war against Jin had yielded more than territory. For the first time, the Mongols were rooted in the settled world. They gained not only plunder, but cities, artisans, technology, and systems of tax and governance. They had learned to build sieges as well as to ride raids, to break stone with machines, to wield fire and powder as weapons. Northern China became a reservoir of strength, feeding the empire with wealth, knowledge and manpower. And the Mongol army, no longer a force of the open steppe alone, was now trained in the art of prolonged siege, ready to carry conquest far beyond its horizons. The gaze of Genghis Khan shifted westward. Beyond deserts and mountains stretched another world, the world of caravan routes and mercantile cities, of walled states and wealthy courts. It was a world unlike the steppe, governed by laws foreign to nomads, a world both alluring and threatening. For any rich state at the frontier of his empire could one day rise as an enemy. The first step west was directed against the Karakitan Empire. This realm had been forged by the remnants of the Liao dynasty. Displaced from northern China, they had carried their banners into Central Asia. There they built an empire across the lands of Temüjin, eastern Turkestan, and parts of modern Xinjiang. For decades, the Karakitans had extracted tribute from the Muslim states of the region. Yet by the early 13th century, their grip was weakening. And into this weakness stepped a familiar figure, Kuyalug, the exiled prince of the Naimans, who had fled after his people were destroyed by Temüjin. He found refuge at the court of the Gurkhan of Karakitan, marrying his daughter. But marriage was only the first step. With cunning and ambition, Kuyalug seized power, stripping the Gurkhan of real authority and making himself master of the empire. His rule soon poisoned the land. Kuyalug turned his hand against the Muslim majority, imposing Buddhism by force, banning Islamic practices, closing mosques, silencing the muezzins, and abolishing Sharia courts. A land once balanced in faith was thrown into turmoil. Anger rose, rebellions flared, and the region shook with unrest. For Genghis Khan, this was more than news. It was opportunity, and Genghis Khan never let opportunity slip away. In the spring of 1218, he acted. A corps under the command of Jebe, one of his finest generals, rode west. The Mongol army swept across Dzungaria, advanced along the Ili River, and entered the lands of the Kara Khitan Khanate. The gates opened before them. One by one the local rulers submitted, knowing that resistance meant annihilation. They bargained not with arms, but with obedience, seeking to preserve their thrones beneath the shadow of a new master. The Gurkhan himself fled, and Kushlug, the usurper prince of the Naimans, attempted to escape into the high mountains of the Pamirs. But there, among the peaks, Mongol riders found him. He was captured. He was executed. The Kara Khitan Empire ceased to exist. Its lands were absorbed into the Mongol realm. Yet the conquest was not only destruction. Genghis Khan restored religious freedom, returning the right of worship to Muslims, and proclaiming once more that all faiths were free, so long as they acknowledged the authority of the great Khan. This campaign marked a turning point, the Mongols' first direct encounter with the Muslim world. For the first time, their armies stood at the gates of the great trade cities of Central Asia, and for the first time, their banners rose within sight of one of the most powerful Muslim states, the Khwarezmian Empire. Khwarezm, at the dawn of the 13th century, was a giant. Its dominion stretched from the southern shores of the Caspian Sea to the mountains of Afghanistan and eastern Iran. It was a centralized state with intricate tax systems, a disciplined army, and thriving international trade. Relations began with peace. Genghis Khan sought alliance, not war. He dispatched a vast trade caravan laden with precious goods, furs, silver, gold, fine fabrics, and weapons. The caravan travelled westward, reaching the frontier city of Otrar, a vital hub of commerce on the Khwarezmian border. But there, fate turned. The governor of Otrar accused the caravan of espionage. His motives remain clouded by time. Was it greed, the temptation of wealth? Was it fear of Mongol power? Was it ambition, or doubt about whether the Shah himself would support submission? Whatever the reason, his choice sealed disaster. The merchants were arrested, their goods seized, their escorts executed. When word of this reached Genghis Khan, he did not unleash his armies at once. Instead, he chose diplomacy. He sent 3 envoys to the Khwarezmian court demanding justice, the punishment of the governor, the return of the goods, and the restoration of peace. The Shah's response was more than refusal. It was insult. 1 envoy was executed. The other 2 were branded with red-hot iron across their foreheads. Their humiliation meant to scar both flesh and memory. It was an act not of defiance, but of provocation. And Genghis Khan never forgot an insult. In the world of the steppe, such an outrage was more than a rejection of a diplomacy. It was a declaration of total war. The branding of envoys, the murder of merchants. These acts could not be answered with words. They demanded steel, fire, and blood. Genghis Khan summoned a Kurultai. The decision was unanimous. The empire would march against Khwarezm, not in a raid, not in a passing strike, but in a full-scale war unlike any the steppes had ever unleashed. Preparations began at once. Chroniclers speak of an army numbering up to 200,000, an unprecedented force for a nomadic power. It was divided into multiple corps, each led by generals tested in battle and bound by discipline. A strategy was devised, both daring and precise. The main body, under Genghis Khan himself, would strike through the lands of Semirechye into Transoxiana. Another force, commanded by Subutai and Jebe, would sweep north around the Aral Sea, falling upon the enemy's rear. A third would push through the passes of the Pamirs, emerging from the south. The Khwarezmian Empire would be struck from every direction. Its armies would find themselves surrounded, its cities cut off, its commanders unable to coordinate defence. So began one of the most devastating campaigns of the 13th century. When the Mongol host crossed into Khwarezm, the land of caravan towns, of mosques and bustling bazaars, of orchards and ancient traditions of craft and trade, it met a force the world had never known. This was not simply an army, it was a perfect engine of war, shaped by the genius of the steppes, driven not only by conquest, but by a relentless logic, to erase resistance, to shatter the old order, to bend all beneath a new one. The first target was Otrar, the city where the insult had begun. Its governor, Inalchuk, who had ordered the execution of the Mongol caravan, knew forgiveness would not come. The siege began in late 1219. Otrar's walls were high, its moats deep, its granaries full. Water flowed through its channels. For 5 long months it resisted. The Mongols unleashed their arsenal of siegecraft, catapults, rams, towers. When the outer walls fell, the garrison retreated into the citadel, fighting on until even the last bastion was broken. Inalchuk was captured alive. His execution became legend. Chroniclers tell of molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment both cruel and symbolic. Historians today suspect the tale may have been shaped by imagination, but there is no doubt that his death was public, agonizing and final. With Otrar destroyed, the Mongol forces divided. Genghis Khan himself led the main host toward the jewels of Transoxiana, Bukhara and Samarkand. Jabi and Subutai swept west in pursuit of Shah Ala ad-Din, who had already begun to flee. Another detachment rode south toward the fertile plains of Merv and Herat, and ahead lay Bukhara, the first great city to test the might of the Khan. The Mongol host encircled the city. Its garrison, unwilling to wait behind the walls, marched out, hoping to challenge the invaders in open battle. But in the fields beyond Bukhara, they were crushed. Their lines dissolved, their banners fell, and the gates were left unguarded. Without a siege, Genghis Khan entered the city. Persian chroniclers record his words, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a scourge like me upon you." The people trembled. Tribute was demanded. A portion of the populace was slaughtered, another enslaved. Yet artisans, smiths, builders, engineers were spared, as was Mongol custom, and sent eastward into the empire. From Bukhara, the road led to Samarkand, the jewel of Transoxiana, the proud capital of the Khwarezmian Empire. Its defences were formidable. Towering walls, a garrison of 40,000, war elephants, and mercenaries from across the lands, including Turkic and even Indian soldiers. The Mongols laid siege, sealing the city in a ring of iron. The defenders made sorties, but each was repelled. Panic grew within the walls. Days passed. Some soldiers surrendered, fearing inevitable defeat. Others deserted, attempting escape. That fracture was all the signal the Mongols needed. The assault began, the city fell, and with its fall came slaughter. The garrison was exterminated. Every man of fighting age was executed. Women and children were dragged into bondage. Only craftsmen, architects, and engineers were spared, carried off to Mongolia or dispersed throughout the empire to build the future of their conquerors. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din, had fled long before. He abandoned Samarkand, wandering from Khorasan to the western fringes of his crumbling realm. At last he found refuge on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea, where sickness struck him down. He died in exile, far from his throne, a king without a kingdom. The final and most formidable bastion was Urgench. Rich beyond measure, nestled in the delta of the Amudarya, it was not merely a trading hub but a spiritual and political heart of the region. Its geography, rivers, marshes, canals, made it a fortress of nature as much as of stone. The siege stretched on for months. Even among Mongol commanders debate arose. Should such a city be spared, its wealth preserved, its workshops seized? Or should it be destroyed utterly to break the will of all who remained? The decision was merciless. When the walls were breached, Urgench was consumed in one of the bloodiest massacres of the campaign. Persian chronicles speak of hundreds of thousands slaughtered. Perhaps an exaggeration, but the devastation was real. The city, once a beacon of prosperity, was erased, its glory extinguished. With Urgench reduced to ruins, Khwarezm ceased to resist. The empire was no more. The Mongols were already accustomed to their grim rhythm: destroy settlements, seize captives, gather herds, and crush any resistance. Southward they moved into Khorasan, and further still toward Iran and Afghanistan. The city of Merv fell in a familiar sequence: a demand for surrender, a refusal, a storming of the walls, and then devastation so complete that few remained to speak of it. And Shapa suffered the same fate, though there the slaughter was marked by a bitter personal vengeance. Chronicles tell of Tolui, son of Genghis Khan, ordering the death of every living soul within the walls to avenge a slain kinsman. Whether the numbers were exaggerated by horrified scribes or not, the memory of the annihilation carved terror into the very soil of Khorasan. From these ruins the greater host began to turn its steps back eastward. Yet not all returned. A chosen corps, commanded by Jabi and Subutai, received orders unlike any before. They were to press westward, beyond the lands known to the steppe, to probe the world that lay past the Caspian Sea, beyond the high ridges of the Caucasus, across boundless plains where unfamiliar tribes wandered. This was not conquest for its own sake, nor was it mere reconnaissance. It was a test of roads, fortresses, cities, and the spirit of peoples. Whoever resisted would be broken, whoever bowed would be spared only to serve. An army of 30,000 riders departed across the vast emptiness, leaving behind the sands of Transoxiana and riding into the great arc of the northern steppes. Their route carried them through the wide grasslands of what is now Kazakhstan, down into the lower reaches of the Volga, and onward toward the shadowed passes of the Caucasus. At every stop their presence was the same: villages reduced to smoke, herds seized, families driven off in chains. Resistance, wherever it sparked, was swiftly crushed beneath iron hooves. On the approach to the Caucasus, they met their first true obstacle. The Alans and the Circassians, ancient mountain peoples, had raised an alliance and gathered at the passes. Narrow valleys echoed with the clatter of arms, the beating of drums, the cries of warriors who knew every rock and ravine of their homeland. For the first time in this westward push, the Mongols faced not towns to burn or scattered tribes to scatter, but defenders rooted deep in mountain soil, unwilling to yield their gates. The riders of the steppe paused before the walls of stone and snow, before an enemy who did not flee. The wind howled through the passes. The world held its breath. The fortified earthworks stood like an island in a sea of enemies, where weary men clung to life for 3 endless days. The mountain tribes had resisted with fury, making every ravine and every cliffside their weapon. Against them, the Mongols, masters of the open steppe, found themselves unprepared for the walls of stone and the labyrinth of high valleys. Yet where steel faltered, cunning replaced it. Jebi and Subutai turned to diplomacy, that subtle edge sharper than any blade. They sent envoys to the Polovtsians, the nomadic Cumans who roamed the northern plains. For centuries these riders had warred with the Alans and Circassians of the mountains. The Mongols spoke their language of opportunity. Join us, strike the mountain tribes together, divide the spoils, and each return to his own. The Cumans agreed. Together, steppe riders and Mongol lancers fell upon the mountain passes. From above and from below, the Alans and Circassians were crushed. Villages were looted, fires rose into the night sky, and chains rattled as prisoners were driven away. Yet the alliance, born of expedience, could not last. Soon after victory, the Mongols revealed their true demand: submission, tribute, obedience to the great Khan. The Cumans refused. Their chief, Kotyan, turned to the Slavic princes across the wide rivers. Messengers rode to Kiev, to Galicia, to Chernigov, carrying pleas for aid. Despite centuries of conflict with the nomadic raiders, the Russ's princes recognized a greater peril. This new enemy was unlike any before, distant, unpredictable, vast as the horizon itself. So, in the spring of 1223, a coalition gathered. From Kiev, from Galicia-Volhynia, from Smolensk, Kursk, and Chernigov they came. At the head rode 3 princes, all sharing one name, as if fate had bound them together. Mstislav of Kiev, Mstislav of Chernigov, and Mstislav the Bold of Galicia. Their host was swelled by Cuman warriors, altogether perhaps 40,000 men. Jebe and Subutai, facing them, unfurled the classic stratagem of the steppe: retreat. The Mongol army fell back deliberately, feigning weakness, scattering just enough to tempt pursuit. The coalition took the bait. Cuman horsemen and Rus contingents pressed forward, forgetting caution, losing unity. Discipline frayed, coordination vanished. Each princely banner moved at its own pace, blind to the greater design. On May 31st, by the banks of the Kalka River, the trap closed. The Mongols wheeled about in sudden precision. Their riders smashed into the Cuman vanguard, shattering it in moments. The Cumans broke and fled, leaving their allies exposed. Then, with practiced swiftness, Mongol wings swept upon the Russ's lines from several directions at once. What had been an army dissolved into fragments? Units fought alone, surrounded, desperate. In the chaos, only Mstislav of Kiev managed to rally his men, erecting a fortified camp of earthworks and wooden palisades. There, in the heat of early summer, they endured 3 days of siege, encircled, cut off, waiting for salvation that never came. The silence of the steppe weighed heavier with each passing night. They placed planks upon the bound princes, feasted above them, and crushed their lives beneath the weight of their victory. The Mongols had no need for haste. They choked off the river, cutting the defenders from water. Days passed. Thirst gnawed, and despair thickened. Then came the offer: surrender, and life would be spared. Trusting in an oath, the defenders opened their gates. The oath was broken at once. Chronicles tell of the princes smothered beneath wooden boards, their bodies crushed while the victors feasted overhead. The rest were slain, save for a handful who escaped with swift horses across familiar steppe. The Battle of the Kalka River was not merely a clash of arms. It was a mirror held up to the Western world. What the Mongols saw confirmed their suspicions: disunity, mistrust, and an inability to act as one. The Cumans fled, the Rus princes quarrelled, the mountain tribes stood alone. To Genghis Khan, this was knowledge more valuable than plunder. Jebi and Subutai turned their riders homeward, carving a path once more through the Caucasus. Circassian villages were looted, Alan fortresses razed, herds driven off in clouds of dust, chains rattled with fresh captives, while wagons groaned under treasure. By 1224 the army returned to Mongolia, their reconnaissance complete. The Great Khan now knew what lay beyond the western horizon, lands rich in gold and grain, but fractured and vulnerable, ripe for a future storm. Yet before that storm could break, another task called him east. Genghis Khan, feeling the weight of years pressing upon him, turned his gaze to an old adversary, the Tangut kingdom of Western Sia. Nestled between the Alashan mountains and the upper bends of the Yellow River, it had long stood as both neighbour and thorn. Years earlier he had forced the Tanguts to kneel, to pay tribute, to send soldiers. But their loyalty had been shallow. Each time his armies marched far away, they delayed their dues, withheld their men, or plotted in silence. During the Khwarezm campaign, they went further still, refusing outright to send aid. In the eyes of the Khan, this was not mere defiance. It was betrayal of the order he had carved from blood and fire, an insult to the very principle of his empire. For in his vision, every conquered nation bent fully, without hesitation, without question. And so, as his riders returned from the western edge of the known world, Genghis Khan prepared for the final campaign of his life, against the Tanguts, against disobedience itself. The steppes held their breath, as the old wolf readied one last hunt. To break faith with the Khan's order was not defiance alone. It was an assault upon the very balance of the world. So it was that in the spring of 1226, the old warrior rode once more. His banners rose across the steppe, leading what would become the last campaign commanded by Genghis Khan himself. The target was Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom that had tested his patience one too many times. The first strike fell upon Huining, a keystone stronghold. It crumbled swiftly, followed by the garrisons that guarded the Tangut frontier. From there, the war spread like wildfire, not only in battle, but in the deliberate ruin of an entire land. Mongol horsemen broke irrigation canals, burned granaries, and trampled fields into dust. The Tangut were not merely fought, they were starved, strangled, and cut off from the lifeblood of their world. Markets and caravanserais were reduced to rubble, warehouses were emptied, caravans seized, trade routes severed. The kingdom of Western Sia, once a bridge between China and Central Asia, was smothered into silence. At Liangzhou the struggle grew fierce. For 2 long months its defenders fought with desperate courage, but the city fell. The Mongols then broke the dams and floodgates, letting thirst and drought finish what their arrows had begun. The fields withered, and famine spread across the valleys like a second army. Marching ever closer to the capital, the Mongols consumed town after town. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Those who yielded were stripped of wealth, deported, driven east in chains. Cities that had thrived for centuries became wastelands overnight. People became shadows, slaves and captives. scattered like dust across the empire. At last the capital itself loomed before them, Genghis standing in a green valley beneath the Helen Mountains. Its walls of stone crowned with towers shone in the sun. It was among the most impregnable fortresses of the region, yet now it lay encircled, its lifelines severed. The siege began, patient, methodical, merciless. And then fate struck the Khan himself. During a hunt, or perhaps through an accident in camp, Genghis Khan fell from his horse. The chronicles disagree. Some say his hip was shattered, others that his spine was injured, but all agree on the consequence. His health faltered, pain deepened, infection set in. Yet even as his body weakened, his will did not. Each day he summoned his generals. Each day he listened to the reports of the siege, issued orders, and spoke of the empire's future. With his sons and his most trusted commanders, he weighed questions of succession, of campaigns yet to come, of how the world would be ruled when his voice was silent. The walls of Zhongxing stood firm. The Khan's body betrayed him, yet his mind still held the map of conquest. By August of 1227, the conqueror who had bent half the world to his will lay captive within his own tent, imprisoned not by chains, but by pain. Genghis Khan's body weakened, yet his voice still commanded. Confined to his portable yurt, his steps stolen by injury, he gathered his sons again and again in those final weeks. He spoke of unity, of the fragile thread binding their vast empire together. He urged them toward the south, against the Song dynasty, and warned that the greatest danger lay not in foreign foes, but in the fracture of their own order. His last lessons were not of conquest, but of preservation. In mid-August, as the siege of Zhongxing dragged on, the Khan's breath finally left him. The heart that had carried him across steppes, deserts, and mountains fell silent. Yet his death was shrouded in secrecy. No whisper of loss was allowed to pass beyond the guarded circle. Orders were still issued in his name, his body hidden within a cart flanked by his most loyal guards. To the army, the great Khan still lived, watching from behind the veil. Shortly after, the city of Zhongxing fell. Its walls crumbled, its people were put to the sword, and Western Xia ceased to exist. The Tangut kingdom, once proud and defiant, was erased from the map, its lands absorbed into the empire. And then came the most enduring mystery. The burial of Genghis Khan became one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Chronicles tell that his body was carried back to Mongolia, to the sacred slopes of the Khenti Mountains. Those who crossed the funeral procession's path were slain. When the burial was complete, horses were driven across the site to trample every trace of earth disturbed. No stone marked the grave, no shrine was built. To this day, the resting place of the great Khan remains unknown, hidden in silence, as if the steppe itself swallowed its son. So ended the life of the orphan who became a legend, from an outcast boy named Temüjin, abandoned in the wilderness. He had risen to forge the greatest land empire the world had ever seen. His story, however, did not end with his death. His shadow lingered. His empire, like a storm, was only at its beginning. For with his passing came a new question. How would the empire endure without the hand that had shaped it? Who among his heirs would rise to hold the world together, from the shores of the Pacific to the waters of the Caspian? The answer would not come from blood alone, but from the ancient steppe tradition that had guided his rule. The Kurultai, the great assembly of elders, generals and clans. Here, and only here, would the next ruler be chosen, not by fate, not by inheritance, but by the voice of the steppe itself. Even before death, the great Khan's shadow stretched into the future, shaping the empire that would outlive him. Genghis Khan had often pondered what would come after him. His eldest son was Jochi, but their bond had frayed by the end of the Khan's life. Old rumours, whispered since Yochi's birth during Berte's captivity among the Merkits, had always cast doubt on his lineage. And in later years, politics deepened the divide. Yochi preferred to remain in the west, ruling the lands granted to him after the conquest of Central Asia. He favoured a gentler hand towards subject peoples, a view at odds with his father's unyielding methods. The rift grew so wide that father and son ceased speaking altogether, yet fate intervened. Yoshi died just months before Genghis Khan himself. The succession crisis that had loomed for years dissolved in one stroke, only to give rise to another. How would power now be balanced between Yoshi's descendants and the surviving sons of the Khan? Among them, the eldest was Chagatai, a stern and uncompromising man, famed for his iron devotion to the Yassa, the code of law. He never hid his disdain for Yochi's line, nor his refusal to treat his brother's children as equals. Tolui, the youngest, was a gifted commander and skilled organizer. But by tradition, the youngest son did not inherit the title of Great Khan. Instead, he became keeper of the ancestral hearth, guardian of Mongolia's central lands and sacred soil. That left Ögedei. The third son, steady of temperament with a gift for diplomacy and the art of mediation. Where others quarrelled, he soothed. Where tension threatened to ignite, he calmed. Genghis Khan, in his final years, had made his will clear. Ögedei would be his successor. It was not only justice, but strategy. In Ögedei's balanced hands, he believed, the empire could be kept whole, safe from the storm of civil war. After the Western campaign and the fall of Western Xia, the Khan's body was secretly laid to rest in the shadowed slopes of the Khenti Mountains. Rule passed first to Berte, his widow, and to Tolui, the youngest son, who governed as regent until the great Kurultai could be convened. But such an assembly was no simple matter. It required not only the presence of the Khan's kin, but the attendance of noyons, generals and envoys from across the empire. From Central Asia, from China, from the Caucasus, and even distant Eastern Europe they were summoned. The journey could take months, in some cases years. The world waited. The empire held its breath. The fate of millions hung on the decision of one gathering beneath the eternal sky. For 2 years the empire waited, suspended between the will of the departed Khan and the decisions of those who would rule in his name. After the burial of Genghis Khan, the vast empire passed into the hands of Tolui as regent. By tradition, the youngest son was custodian of the homeland, and in this role Tolui took charge not only of Mongolia's sacred hearth, but of the entire empire until the great Kurultai could be summoned. Beside him stood Berte, the widow of the Khan, whose authority as mother of the dynasty commanded respect across the steppe. Tolui proved himself not merely a caretaker, but a leader of formidable skill. He managed the empire's internal affairs, ensuring discipline in the army, maintaining the strict application of the Yassa, and organizing the flow of tribute, resources and manpower from the conquered lands. His stewardship preserved the fragile unity of the Mongol realm, at a moment when division could easily have torn it apart. Yet even Tolui's authority was temporary. All knew that the question of succession must be settled openly, before the eyes of the empire. To this end, envoys were dispatched in every direction. carrying summons to the princes of the blood, the Noyans, the generals, and the rulers of vassal peoples. They travelled from the far corners of the Khan's dominion, from the cities of northern China and the plains of Central Asia, from the mountains of the Caucasus, from the oases of Persia, and even from the steppes of Eastern Europe, where Mongol banners had already been carried by the thunder of hooves. The scale of this gathering was unprecedented. Never before had such a vast and diverse assembly been called under the eternal sky. The journey itself was a measure of power, months of travel, in some cases years, across deserts, mountains, and endless plains. When the Kurultai finally convened, it was not merely a council of succession. It was a manifestation of empire itself, a display of the unity forged by conquest and the law of the Yassa. Here, the voices of the princes and generals would determine not only who would bear the title of Great Khan, but also how the legacy of Genghis Khan would be carried forward into new campaigns and new lands. At its heart lay the question of Ögedei. Would the will of the late Khan be honoured, or would ambition, rivalry, and suspicion drive his sons and their descendants into conflict? The fate of the Mongol Empire balanced on this decision, even as Tolui continued to hold the reins with a steady hand, keeping the machine of war and rule intact until the empire spoke with one voice again. From the wisdom of a widow and the compromises of brothers, the empire found unity in the shadow of its founder's death. It was Berta, the great Khatun, who played the decisive role in ensuring that the empire did not fracture during the perilous transition after Genghis Khan's death. Her moral authority was immense, for she was not only the Khan's first and most respected wife, but also the mother of his heirs. In those uncertain years, her presence held the balance between competing centres of power, preventing tensions from erupting into civil strife. The long-awaited Kurultai was convened in 1229. It was one of the most significant gatherings in Mongol history. From the very first days, it became clear where the deepest divisions lay, between Chagatai and the line of Jochi. Jochi was gone, but his eldest son Batu, though still young, had already emerged as a real power in the western steppe. Chagatai, known for his uncompromising character and adherence to the Yassa, bluntly declared that he did not recognize the Yochid line as equal, echoing old doubts about Jochi's parentage. The quarrel nearly turned violent, threatening to plunge the empire into fratricidal war. At that crucial moment, it was Tolui who intervened. Acting with remarkable foresight, he renounced any claim to the supreme title and instead urged the assembly to uphold the will of their father, to raise Ögedei as Great Khan. Ögedei's temperament, marked by balance, diplomacy and patience, made him the most suitable to preserve the fragile unity of the empire. His brothers and nephews, after heated debate, accepted the compromise. The arrangement maintained the empire as a single whole, but divided administration among the branches of the family. Each line was granted its own sphere, governed according to the Yassa, but always subject to the authority of the Great Khan. The Yochid line was entrusted with the western steppes, Central Asia, and the lands that would later form the Golden Horde. The Chagataids were given Fergana and eastern Turkestan. The Toluids held the central Mongolian heartlands, guarding the ancestral hearth around the Khenti Mountains. The Ögedeids retained supreme power, overseeing the empire's key administrative and commercial centres. Once Ögedei was confirmed as Great Khan, the Kurultai turned to matters of governance and future expansion. It reaffirmed the necessity of campaigns both to the south, against the Song dynasty, and to the west, toward Eastern Europe and the Islamic world. The assembly also introduced reforms that gave the empire a new administrative backbone, a strengthened tax system and regular census of populations and revenues, the establishment of the Yam, the great postal relay system, with stations stretching across thousands of kilometers to ensure the swift movement of couriers, orders, and intelligence, the consolidation of military discipline and law under the universal authority of the Yassa. Thus, even after the death of the man who had forged it, the Mongol Empire did not fracture. Instead, it entered a new phase of expansion, transforming from a collection of conquered territories into a true superpower, bound together by law, administration, and the vision of universal dominion. When the dust of battles had settled and the memory of Genghis Khan began to shift from a rallying cry to a legend, it became undeniable that a man born without wealth, without status, and without allies had reshaped not only the fate of his people, but the course of world history itself. The empire forged by Genghis Khan had no true precedent in world history. It was not merely a patchwork of conquered lands held together by fear. It was an integrated system, built upon discipline, uniform law, and an administrative and military framework so well organized that it endured long after his death. Stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from the Siberian forests to the Himalayas, this empire bound together East and West under the authority of a single state for the very first time. The most enduring achievement of Genghis Khan lay not only in the territories he conquered, but in the model of governance he created. Where once the Mongolian steppe was a mosaic of warring tribes, fragile alliances, and rival khanates, he imposed a unifying structure, the Great Yassa. This was not just a military code, but a comprehensive set of laws covering both civil and political life. Its brilliance was its universality. No matter whether one was a shepherd, a merchant, a city governor, or a noble of ancient lineage, violation of the law was punished the same. This principle of impartial justice was revolutionary in a world where privilege and bloodline had always outweighed fairness. Another pillar of his vision was religious tolerance. At a time when crusades, jihads, and sectarian violence dominated much of Eurasia, Genghis Khan enforced a radically different order. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, and the shamanic traditions of the steppes all had the right to practice freely. Temples, mosques, monasteries, and shrines were protected. Religious leaders were exempt from taxation and conscription, securing their loyalty and influence. The only condition was absolute allegiance to the Great Khan himself. This principle transformed the Mongol realm into a rare sanctuary of pluralism in a fractured medieval world. Under his rule, the Silk Road experienced a renaissance. Centuries of decline caused by endless wars, raids, and fragmented kingdoms gave way to a new age of safe passage. Merchants could now traverse vast distances, from the Volga to the Chinese heartland, under the shield of Mongol armies that policed the trade routes. Goods, knowledge, and even entire technologies moved with unprecedented speed and safety across the continent. Paper, gunpowder, medicine, art, and architecture all flowed along these arteries of exchange. For the first time since antiquity, Eurasia was bound into a single, functioning network of exchange. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan carries a darker weight. His name is forever linked to destruction on a colossal scale. The burning of cities, the annihilation of entire populations, the erasure of cultural centres and libraries, all became hallmarks of his campaigns. The devastation of Khwarezm, the sack of Bukhara and Samarkand, the massacres at Nishapur, the obliteration of northern China, these were written into chronicles as unprecedented acts of violence. Whole regions were depopulated, and the memory of terror lingered for generations. And still, when viewed through the long lens of history, his reign was not only an age of ruin, but also a catalyst for a new global order. The Mongol Empire created for the first time a framework in which Eurasia functioned as an interconnected system, economically, politically, and culturally. Never before had people, ideas, and goods moved so freely across such immense distances. Remarkably, Genghis Khan himself was illiterate, with no formal education. Yet his brilliance lay in his strategic vision, his adaptability, and his uncanny ability to learn from others. He borrowed technologies, administrative practices, and even military innovations from the peoples he subdued, fusing them into a system stronger than any one culture could have devised alone. It was this pragmatic genius that elevated him beyond the role of conqueror into one of the greatest state builders in human history. He possessed a rare gift, the ability to recognize talent wherever it appeared, regardless of origin or lineage. In his armies and administration served men from across the known world: Uyghurs, Chinese, Persians, Khwarezmians, Russians, Arabs, and Tibetans. The finest engineers, siege masters, physicians, scribes, and builders found protection and patronage under his rule. The empire that had grown from a nomadic yurt became a sophisticated system where the traditions of the steppe merged with the bureaucratic precision of China, the tax administration of Persia, and the mercantile expertise of the Islamic world. After his death, the empire did not collapse. On the contrary, it continued to expand. His sons and grandsons completed the conquest of China, destroyed Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate, shattered Poland and Hungary, and brought Korea and parts of Southeast Asia under Mongol power. Yet, as with any vast state born from the vision of a single leader, fragmentation eventually followed. The empire divided into independent khanasses, each charting its own course, but all still carrying the imprint of the laws, decisions, and order first laid down by Genghis Khan. For all its armies, countless cities, and tens of millions of subjects, the memory of Genghis Khan is not simply that of a conqueror. It is the memory of a man who transformed the chaos of the steppe into a force powerful enough to reshape half the world. His name endures in history, for some a symbol of destruction, for others of order, law, and strength, and for still others a reminder that even one who was cast out, stripped of everything, and left to fend for himself could change the world through sheer will, determination, and talent. And today, as caravan routes have become highways, as aircraft soar above the skies once crossed by riders, and as railroads cut through the steppe, the name of Genghis Khan resounds just as it did 8 centuries ago, short, powerful, and majestic. Genghis Khan, the man who changed the world.